Welcome, everyone, to our next edition of the Mediate.com book club. I am delighted to be here with my good friends, Marc and Colin, to talk about their new book, which I just love. I think there's a quote actually from me that says, "I love this book." And that is true because I do love this book. There's so much great grist for the mill. And I love that the two of you are out there talking about ODR, educating the field. It's such a wonderful contribution. So this is going to be, this is my happy place today, this conversation with the two of you. So thank you for making the time. But so I've got a lot of questions and I want to get into the substance of ODR, but first let's just talk about the book itself. Like, how did this I know Marc, you've got a publishing company, so that probably is a leg up here. But how did you come across the idea of writing this book? How did you come across the format? What was the genus of the project?
Yeah, well, I have to give Marc credit for that. Marc, when I did my LLM 20 years ago, my major paper was an ODR, and Marc did his LLM a couple of years ago, and his major paper was an ODR.
From the same place, right? From Osgoode, yeah.
Yeah, and so Marc basically said, "You still have a copy of that paper in Word, so you didn't have to change it for anything else." Yeah. So that, and some of the other stuff we've written over the years, nothing like you, but some of the other stuff we've written over the years, we thought consolidating it made sense.
Sure.
And we deliberately didn't have someone edit it into the same voice because we wanted to have our voices as well.
It feels like a conversation because of that, which I love. Yeah,
but that's the beginning of it. So you got to give Marc credit for doing that. He also is a good taskmaster and kept me on track.
Cracking the whip,
as
they say. Yeah, that's great. So, and Marc, what was it like working with Colin on this project?
Oh, we've done a lot together over the years in terms of writing together, presenting together. So it was very comfortable and natural. He's not against me, giving him the whip every once in a while and being a little bit of a taskmaster. So that was good. And I think we both saw an opportunity with COVID and in our market so much shutting down that the timing was right. So that certainly helped keep us motivated to get it going.
Absolutely. Oh, please, Colin.
Yeah, COVID was part of it. But we didn't, eventually we come out of COVID, and we didn't want people to think that we'd all jumped online. And that was when it began. We wanted people to realize that people like you had been working on it for many, many years. This isn't a new thing, although people were looking at it that way. So it was just good timing to send that message as well.
Well, I love the framing of yesterday, today, and tomorrow. I think it's a great way to sort of, look back. I put in my forward column, the first time I ever met you was, I think, when you reviewed my first book. This is way back in 2002. And who is this guy? I like him. He says good things about my book on Amazon. So we reached out, and we've been friends ever since, friends and colleagues in promoting this. And you were a really valued advisor for Modria through many of our formative years. So I love that. I think oftentimes I see a lot of people that have joined the bandwagon recently, like maybe during the pandemic. And, and Marc, I think I read one quote from you that was talking about sort of ODR is more than video conferencing, and I think there are a lot of people like, oh, I do ODR, I'm on Zoom, and it's like, well, there's actually a deep well of, theory and practice and research. This isn't something we just invented when COVID emerged in, March 2020. So I like that. I like to look back. And then where are we now and where is it going? Because sometimes the stuff that's all focused on the future is just way too diffuse. Like, well, maybe we'll have flying carpets in 10 years. Maybe we'll have antennas in our ears in 10 years. It's like, okay, maybe not. But I think the grounding in the past and where we are practically today and talking about the future, I think that's a great framing. So, Marc, I don't know, was that part of your design?
Very, very much so. I thought exactly as you said, so many people in our world here just felt like it was as simple as jumping on Zoom without appreciating the deeper skills and deeper platforms. And I know, Colin, for years you've been saying that if you really look into it, that's almost like the starting point, but you get much deeper, much richer if you look at things like asynchronous, text-based, things that people who just try to replicate in-person processes online don't appreciate at all, to help us overcome a lot of the challenges that come with those traditional processes that unfortunately so many people just put on a pedestal and try to replicate, and you can't. It's not the same thing, right? So to be able to delve that little bit deeper and understand just how much there is to consider, it's not just getting a Zoom account and you're good to go.
Well, Colin, please. What were you going to say?
No, it's okay. No, I'll
Well,
comment
what I
after
was
you.
just I was gonna echo that sentiment. You know, it's funny, people say to me, "Oh, we're such a visionary. You saw this whole ODR thing happening." If you go back and look at my writing, I was a skeptic about mobile. I was a skeptic about video. I was a skeptic about AI, you know, and I've been, you know, when I first started doing ODR, I said, no family disputes. It's not going to work. It's got to be only transactional disputes. So there's a long record of me being wrong too. But it's exactly, you know, what you're saying. I think the culture is changing. I think the tools are changing. Our openness is changing. There was a quote that I read from one of you. I'm trying to see which one it is, but it essentially said, you know, we have to use these technologies that people use in their everyday lives. It's already been normalized, you know. These are the things that people are using in their work. They're already using them to communicate with their families. They're using them, you know, to buy tickets to a concert on the weekend. So it's not a matter of dispute resolution, you know, introducing this technology and then people having to adopt it. It's been introduced in other areas of their lives and they've already adopted it. So we in the dispute resolution field have to figure out how to integrate that in the way we do things too. So please, Colin, what were you going to say? I cut you off.
No, it's okay. It was interesting what you said about looking at it in a kind of skeptical way, because I think I felt the same way. But what kind of really piqued my interest was the idea of, you know, as you know, Canada is a very big country, but population right along the border and other places. And it always struck me that using technology in dispute resolution would make sense. And I was particularly looking at family, you know, safe space, be able to have people in Vancouver have their hearing with the other side in Toronto instead of one or the other having to come all the way, particularly in family law where costs are a massive issue. But, you know, I think it was in March of 2003, maybe, I spoke for the first time after finishing my paper. And it was it was at a university annual symposium on ODR. And I spoke to a family law group, and it'd be fair to say I wasn't well received. It was like, it was a kind of, I was being a heretic. You couldn't do that. You had to be in place. You know, you all these things. And those excuses kept coming. So, I mean, Marc's tried for years and I've tried for years to get people engaged, but it has to be driven by necessity. And I think that was the kind of boost that we needed. But again, we didn't want people to say, oh, it's the same. Well, no, it's not. It's similar in some ways if you're just doing video, but that's just scratching the surface.
Well, I remember there was a giant in the dispute resolution field who will go unnamed, but I asked them to be an advisor to one of my early ODR companies. And they essentially called me into their office and sat me down and said, this is bad for dispute resolution. What you're doing is bad. We're about getting people to sit at the table and look in each other's eyes and hold each other's hands. And, you know, if you're saying they can go online and go click on a website and resolve their dispute, you're moving things in the wrong direction. And I was like, oh, I was just a kid, you know, I was overwhelmed by their skepticism about it. And I said, well, what about people who don't know each other and they've only met online and they've engaged in some transaction? And, you know, like if you tell them they have to do it face to face, they can't because the person went, and they said, that's okay. You could do those, but you can't do anything where the parties can meet face to face. That was essentially what he said. And to his credit, I think he's completely come around. And I think we've all had this experience too. Experienced mediators who told us, no, you can't do this online. And then the pandemic happens and then they try Zoom mediation. And now they say, I love Zoom mediation. I default to Zoom mediation. I think, Marc, you said, maybe it was with Ian, you said, I've seen the inside of more people's houses, you know, since the pandemic.
Yeah.
You know, and Ian said, "Oh, wow, you're you know, now
voyeuristic tendencies.
Your voyeuristic tendencies are being,
yeah.
But I agree with you. I mean, to be able to mediate with someone when they're sitting in their kitchen with their cat on the lap. I mean, you know, and they're like, you know what? Why don't we take a 5-minute break? I'm going to make a cup of tea in my own kitchen, in my own mug. You know, like that wasn't a possibility before. And I think, as you say, Colm, it was necessity that forced people to do it because there was no alternative. And then once they tried it, then it broke the seal. Yes. And now they're never going to go back. We're never going to unring the bell, and we're never going to go back to November 2019 because they've had this experience.
No, and it's kind of interesting you say that because I did the first in-person mediation I've done in an awful long time on Monday.
Oh, wow.
And it was a very difficult one. There were some mental health issues involved, and I've been thinking about it a lot. Is that one that really needed in person, or could it have been online? And I'm leaning towards in person. But on the positive side, I mean, I was in a mediation today, which was scheduled for the day, but one of the parties was having difficulty, a little bit elderly with some health issues.
Mm,
It's getting funny when I say elderly because I'm getting there too. But it was one of those situations where, it was becoming questionable if we were going to have a good outcome. And
mm,
so I was able to ask the lawyers, person's getting tired, you don't make great decisions. Can we turn the day into 2 half days? And they said, sure, yeah, let's do that. Well, I would have got a lot of pushback if we were in person. We'd driven into the city, everybody was scheduled. So I think the tool and flexibility it adds is just astonishing. And we're only just scratching the surface of it.
mm. Well,
Yeah.
and yeah,
Go ahead.
Mark, please. No, I want to hear from you.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say it's something we've been talking about for decades and generations, the flexibility of the ADR process. I don't think that there is a tool or a platform that allows us to leverage that the same way that online technologies do. And now that people have had to adapt based on the pandemic and becoming more familiar and getting over that initial hesitation, I think they're starting to appreciate how far it goes. A lot of those traditionalists of, oh, put everybody in the same room and, just pick up the phone. Well, a lot of people don't do that as part of the normal course of their lives anymore. I know my
Mhm.
voicemail message tells people to email me. Most of the time these days, people are communicating through these technologies. So it's as you mentioned, Colin, we're trying to just leverage what people are already familiar with. And the idea of being able to participate in the mediation from the comfort of your own home with your cat on your lap, being able to get a cup of your own tea and drink out of your own mug, as opposed to going into some unfamiliar territory of a stuffy law office or formal setting that you're going to be intimidated by. It, in terms of maximizing what we can do out of the collaboration process and opportunities, this allows us to do it in a much more comfortable way, which I think is a recipe for success.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, and the norms are changing too. I think that's one of the things that you talked about. Like I think one of the quotes from you, Mark, in the book is, "I propose that shared cultural understanding is needed to understand in-person cues such as body language and common sayings, just as such are needed to understand online communications. The cues still exist; they're just presented differently online." And I love that because I think that mediation is shaping technology, right? We're building technologies around the mediation process that meet the needs of mediators, but technology is shaping mediation. And I really do feel what's happened through the pandemic. It's not, Zoom existed before the pandemic. It's pretty much in exactly the same form that it exists, but people have completely changed the way they mediate. And Colm, I love what you're talking about in terms of splitting the meeting. Like, sure, we could do that. Let's reconvene tomorrow, or let's reconvene in an hour. I'm seeing, again, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of talk about breakout rooms and let's use breakout rooms in mediation. Well, now I don't feel like people do that much because you just do separate calls. You say, why don't you jump off for 30 minutes? We'll have a discussion. You can log back in, or why don't we take a break for, 15 minutes? I got to go walk my dog and then we'll come back. Like, that's not really possible when you're, as you say, Mark, driving down to some lawyer's conference room, and everybody's there in their, stiff suit and sitting across the table from the person they can barely stand to look at. I think that the new capabilities of technology are changing, as are the norms. And I think because we've normalized online interaction, there's nothing artificial about it anymore. I remember also at the beginning of the pandemic, people always said, you need eye contact. So look into the camera so they can see your eyes. And now that's like incredibly creepy if somebody's looking into the camera, because we all have normalized looking down. That's where the faces are. If somebody's looking in the camera, they know, they're not looking at your face. So I think it's fascinating to see this evolution occur in real time.
Yeah, very much so. And even before the pandemic, one thing that I was finding is there was a bit of a push amongst lawyers, especially, to kind of do away from joint sessions. So you'd spend all that time traveling to the same location for the parties to end up being in separate rooms to begin with. If you're going to spend your time in mediation in a caucus type situation, what's the point in being physically present, right?
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
very good point. Yeah. Well, so another quote that I really liked, and I'm not sure if this is from the interview or from the book, but you talk about the use of technology has sort of become a way of life, and integrating the technologies that people are already using. I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit more about that. About now we have, obviously the big thing is AI, right? And AI is coming down the pike. That's sort of the shiny new thing. But I was wondering if you could just talk about, like, how can we normalize the use of this? How can we meet people where they are and put them at ease with the use of this technology, even as the technology we have at our disposal is evolving?
Mark?
Okay, well, I think that's really the main principle that I have in my practice is I want people to be as comfortable as possible. So I try to work with what they're already familiar with, whether that be for example, if they're used to Zoom, let's mediate on Zoom. I think it's the same thing with AI. As people become more comfortable, these days a lot of those that I interact with like to use some of the nice game type things or entertainment that comes out of AI, being able to recite things. But the concepts that we've been seeing here are proactive approaches, being able to help people understand what are reasonable potential outcomes. And as they get familiar with using those types of technologies for, how long it's going to take for my pizza to come, what's the traffic going to be like, being able to use AI for those types of things, you can just apply it to their conflict resolution. So to me, it's no different than everything else that you've spoken about, Colin, in terms of just applying what they're using as they go about living their lives to be able to most naturally and comfortably address their disputes.
Yeah, I agree, Mark. And one of the things that interested me is, clearly I hadn't looked at some of the stuff I'd written in a long time. Looking at it, it struck me how even years ago, most of what we were saying stays the same, even though the technology has advanced immensely. And not just in dispute resolution, but everybody's using technology in a different way. I remember being in Ireland quite a few years ago and noticing the difference between Ireland and North America. At that time, everybody there was using text and we hadn't got there, well, in Canada anyway. And now everyone's coming up to the same. We can communicate with people, well, particularly in our view, across Canada. We can do our webinars and all kinds of things, which would have been very difficult to get to without people being much more familiar. And we've also been able to jump the kind of divides, and there are many of those, but the age one in particular. We've had people talk to my grandkids. Of course, I can do this on Zoom and all those things. So it's not only young people developing technology, but it's spreading across a range of cultures, ages, all kinds of demographics. And the oldest person I've had in a mediation was 94, and that's exactly what she said. And we split it into 2-hour mediations.
Wow.
It's going to be 4 hours. But she said, no, I talked to my kids and my grandkids and my great grandkids, and I know how to use this. And her lawyer was a bit reluctant, But
the lawyer was reluctant, but the 94-year-old was into it. Yeah.
Yeah, which to me just shows how technology has, spread. And I think that's, a good thing in most ways. Yeah.
Well, and I think if there's any benefit that Zoom and video has brought is that it makes me think also of the introduction of the iPhone and the iPad. There were certain populations that couldn't really utilize the classic laptop approach. I think about little kids and I think about elderly individuals where typing is sometimes a challenge. And then to be able to have a touch screen opened up technology to those populations. I think video is the same way. It's close enough to a face-to-face interaction that once you get the corner of your house set up, you get your computer working, you got Zoom plugged in, you've got your camera working. Well, I feel like I'm sitting in the same room with the two of you right now. I really am. Fundamentally, it's not that different. Although I will note that there are some important differences between, and I think some of those work to the advantage of dispute resolution. I met somebody face-to-face the other day who I'd never met before, and we just interacted on Zoom probably 100 times. And wow, he was tall. I had no idea. Like, I only knew him shoulders up, and I had no idea this guy was 6'6". I was like, what? But in a face-to-face mediation, size can be intimidating. And that's something that is a factor you need to address as a mediator too, is that kind of intimidation factor. And online, there's an element of, no, I mean, I can seem really big by getting close to the camera. I can seem really small by getting far away. I think that's it's another dynamic that we don't even think about that, but it's a powerful change in the way that that people interact online. And it's a field leveler in a sense. Yeah.
Very much. Now, one of the concerns remains, it was brought up even back in the 90s, that not everybody has the same access to technology. And,
Right. The
we've
digital
come a
divide.
long way. We've come a long way, but you still hear that. And I think that in this day and age, it just comes to making sure that you have an understanding, an expectation of what the technological requirements are for the process, and catering to the people that you're working with. It
Right.
doesn't really make a difference, because technology is so widespread that even if you end up going with an asynchronous text-based approach, you can still utilize technology and accomplish something in ODR that's much more difficult to do in person, because not everybody can afford to give up a day of work and travel halfway across the city to pay an enormous amount for parking if they even have a car. You know what I mean? So
Absolutely.
I think,
Well, Colin and I think remember this well, because in the early days of ODR, that was the argument. Well, only rich people have access to technology.
Mhm.
So if you use that for dispute resolution or for access to justice, you're building a system only for rich people. But I think technology has, as you say, it's democratized. Now, I mean, you can get a phone at the drugstore, for $30. And, pretty much in the United States, 95% of people have mobile devices. Oftentimes the people that don't have mobile devices are the really rich people, because they're, kind of rejecting the whole thing. But that is an interesting leveler. But I think we always have to, as ODR systems designers and ODR service providers, we have to think about how do we level the playing field, not only in terms of dynamics between the parties, but also their access to tech. I mean, if you have one party that's got gig internet and Pentium 7, and they're cranking it, they can type 100 words a minute, and the other side is on a dial-up modem, or they're on a phone, you may be creating an imbalance between the parties just by utilizing one frame of interaction. And you may say, you know what, we're going to do audio conferencing, because that's going to level the playing field.
Mhm.
So yeah.
at the same time, the libraries here, their sustainability plan has to do with offering people internet access. I go to my local library, and there are a number of rooms that you can reserve now that have you fully set up for a video conference. Some of them are
Right.
specifically designed, for example, for job interviews for people.
Mhm.
So it's not as though it's that hard to access, or you need to have a base amount of income to be able to access it. The options are there in this day and age.
Well, and in Silicon Valley, the libraries actually set up fast Wi-Fi, and they project it into the parking lot. So sometimes I go to the library and there's more people in the parking lot on their phones and laptops than there are inside the library. So the very definition of what libraries are good for, I think, is a moving target. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
But
all about information, right?
yeah,
How
I
you
mean,
convey
access.
information.
I really want to I want to talk about access, and then I want to come back to what you said, Colin, too, about culture, because I think this is a very interesting one, and it's something that I think we in the ODR field have not done a good enough job thinking about. But I think that sometimes we just say, well, everybody's got access to phones. Everybody, in India, they don't give out textbooks anymore. They give out tablets. These cheap Android tablets, because the textbooks get destroyed, and these kids are going home to villages. Sometimes they don't even have electricity, so they can charge the tablet at school and then go home and they do their homework from the light of the tablet. I mean, it's an amazing thing to think about. But I do think now we are in the AI revolution, and I think we have a new access to justice challenge, because I think there's going to be a period of time where rich people and high power parties, they have access to these tools, they know how to utilize them, and the low power parties won't have access to these tools. And the people with AI are probably going to be able to run circles around the people without AI for a certain period of time. So, I think this is going to be an ongoing challenge for those of us who are ODR systems designers to think, as tools get introduced, access is not going to be universal, and it may advantage some parties over others. And how can we design the systems in such a way that it does level the playing field? So what do you all think about that?
Well,
I think there's. Sorry,
Mark.
Colin, please go ahead. Go
It's
ahead.
okay. What I was going to say is, I think one of the keys to that is not necessarily focused on technology, but is focused on standards, and having accepted standards as the minimum base. And if you go above that, you go above it. But the standards at least allow,
Sure.
like the ICODER standards, for example, allow you to participate at a certain level. Now, the AI thing is really interesting, because up to recently, lots of people were talking about AI, but they'd all been doing it. It would have been a different world, but now it's suddenly flipped. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes for what we do.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if parties are using ChatGPT to, draft their responses. So, Mark, what were you going to say?
Well, I was going to say, I think an added challenge to that whole consideration is the trust bias factor. That as soon as you start relying on algorithms, it's a lot harder to identify if there's some kind of bias programmed in there. So transparency and some base level of understanding surrounding the types of standards that Colin was talking about, I think would help. If you're going to rely on AI for example, predictive analysis, you need to make sure that there is some base criteria to know that that predictive analysis isn't going to somehow be swayed in somebody else's favor. Particularly those who aren't familiar with technology, I find they tend to initially want to put a wall up and have some mistrust. So we need to get over that hump. And once you have everybody comfortable that you can trust, it's no different than any other type of evaluation coming from a third party neutral. You're just having it from an algorithm as opposed to a human being.
Well, there are a couple of other things we have to be concerned about, I think, is there's this idea of bias that we're very happy to talk about with humans, but we don't really look at the bias inherent in technology. And that may change. I mean, but even when we're a generation more into AI, somewhere at the back of that, a human programmed something and the bias went into that. What I find really interesting is people, well, they look at machines as not having bias, while at the same time trying to make machines human-like or ascribing human value to it, as we've seen with some of the conversations with Chat GBT that have been in the media. So
well, yeah, I think one of the things I love about the book, you spend a lot of time talking about some of the downsides. Like there's a whole chapter on systemic bias that I think is really interesting. And again, this is a moving target, right? Because I think as we do invest more authority in the fourth party, there are going to be individuals that want to put their thumb on the scale. And it's going to be very, very hard for end users to know what's going on behind the scenes. So I mean, I agree with you, Colm. That's what iCoder is all about. Hopefully, we're going to be able to audit and get transparency on these mechanisms, so that we're not just evaluating them by the output. We can evaluate them also by the input and the process. I worry about these black box AIs that are going to generate outcomes which may bias processes beyond the ability for the parties to understand how that bias is being inserted into the conversation. But we don't even know why is it the AI is generating this or that. I mean, I think we need to come up with AIs, at least in the ODR space, that can show their work, so we know a little bit more of the process, because so much of what we offer is process. We can't just say, okay, well, here's your outcome, $356.28. And the parties are like, what? I mean, that may be based on reading 10 million court cases and, in 15 different languages, but it makes me think of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where they ask the computer about, what's the answer to life, the universe, and everything? And it says 42. And they're like, what? It may be right, but if you don't understand how it came up with that number, it doesn't add a lot of value. So we can't outsource the psychology of the justice journey to an AI and presume that people are going to feel the same closure, the same, fairness from it. Mark, what were you going to say?
Oh, no, very much. I agree with everything that you're saying. One of the pieces I talk about at the very end of the book is my frustration watching a game of baseball in this day and age, and how we rely on a human umpire to call a ball and strike. When I watch it on TV, it's very clear the technology is there to show us if the ball lands in the strike zone or not, and we're all left to wonder and see if the umpire is able to, as a human being, get it right when the technology is readily available.
Right.
I see the future being, instead of equipping everybody but the decision maker with the technology, we equip the decision maker with the technology to help them get it right. So to me, in the future, in baseball, the umpire will have the same access as all of the rest of us in order to find out if a pitch is a ball or a strike. And I see that being no different in dispute resolution going forward, where if we marry the two and we have a human decision maker being able to access some of these tools, that helps us transition into a way that makes sense, so that you have the human component as a check and balance to help make sure that the outcome is right, to help explain the context as needed, but also equip them to avoid some of the human errors and some of the human biases that we somehow all of a sudden take for granted as soon as we start pointing the finger and criticizing everything that's wrong with technology and pretending that what we have in place as human beings is perfect.
I couldn't agree with that more. What frustrates me is when people criticize ODR in comparison to their ideal of the justice system with the blindfolded lady and the scales, that is nowhere near the reality of the justice system as we currently have it. We talk about the crisis of self-represented litigants, and we know in the United States that people of color have gotten 30% worse outcomes out of the courts for the last 50 years, and there's been no change really in that number. this is an opportunity for us to rethink the foundations and build a system that is better. And I love that referee, that umpire analysis. It makes me think of the tennis games, where the line judge goes out and the player goes, no, that was in. And then they go to the tape and then it shows there's the bounce and it turns out it was in. At what point? I mean, we're making ourselves feel better by having that human there calling it. But the technology does know the truth, and now we have the technology kind of assisting the human. Like you can get a review, like was it a strike? Was it in? But eventually we're just going to say, okay, just let's let the technology make the call. We don't need the human there, making the mistake and then having to file an appeal in order to have. We'll just let the technology say it was in, it was out every single time. And but I think there are some people who are worried about that. It's like, wait a minute. Where is the agency? Where is the humanity? Where's the empathy? But do you need that if you're just calling whether or not it's a ball or a strike, or whether or not the serve was in or out? So yeah.
One of the nice things of working with Marc is he has all these great sports or pop culture analogies that he brings up, and it kind of changes things. We have, one of the things that we're talking about access to justice, yet lawyers are remarkably absent from the discussions around technology and ODR, and it's driven by people with an interest in technology and dispute resolution, but not necessarily traditional legal approach. And that concerns me because I see ADR and ODR as they're a wee bit different. It's providing us with tools, but are we talking about just outcomes or the justice system and access to it? And that's and not my comment, as somebody made it on a webinar yesterday that Marc was presenting on. What are we looking for here? And will technology help us get there? If you can do, as Marc says, you can balance, because bias is something we've been looking at a lot more seriously in the last few years. And in Canada, the example would be the imprisonment of a disproportionately high number of Indigenous people in our criminal justice system. That's human bias. What happens when that gets sped up by being machine bias? And how do we stop that? How do we impose standards? So we talked about a number of different things, but then decided, just we stick them together and see what happens. And that's how the book came together. We also made a deliberate decision that we would use Marc's knowledge of self-publishing to actually publish it, because one of our concerns would be that it would be an expensive proposition and people wouldn't look at it. And we wanted people to do that. We're always astonished, I know Marc, and so am I, when you see something about access to justice that costs, $200 or $300.
The irony.
The book on access to justice itself is inaccessible. It's great.
Yeah, I love that. Well, I think that it is a very interesting question. I think one of the things that the internet has achieved, and I think the internet is a technology writ large, is it's removed a lot of the gatekeepers. I remember when I was a kid, to write a book or record an album, that was a very rare proposition, because you had to get a studio, you had to, have a publisher, you'd have to, it was a multi-year thing to go through that process. Now Marc, more about this world than I do, but you can type up a Word doc or a Google Doc and send it to services, and they'll print it up and bind it for you, and it'll be in the mail in a couple of days. They have a lot of publishers now that are on-demand publishers, so they don't actually carry the stock because they can generate these books so quickly. But also, I think it's fascinating from a music perspective to think that anybody can fire up GarageBand on their computer and put together some beats, and then you put it on Spotify and it's the next big hit. And that it used to be that there were gatekeepers, there were record labels. They controlled the means of creation, they controlled the means of distribution. So, we kind of take for granted the degree to which that kind of the ability to spread your creative work has been democratized by technology. And I think that's a wonderful thing. You talked before also, I just had a conversation with a prominent mediator, and he was saying, I'm mediating all over the world. Like, I never could have done this before ODR. And that's another thing. Mediators used to be locked into their geography. If you were in Saskatoon, that was pretty much where you're going to mediate. How many people are there? How many cases are there? But now it's like, get on Zoom. Sure, I can work across Canada. I can work across the Americas. I can work around the world, if I'm willing to stay up late enough. So I think that democratization of access is transformative and often overlooked in terms of how much it's changed the world that we live in.
Yeah, I think we have to be a wee bit careful about that as well, because, I'm wondering if, we use all this brilliant technology for access to justice, but do we do it at the same level for everyone? Because, when you developed the eBay dispute resolution, you were looking at small amounts of disputes, financially, jurisdictional issues. And so it was great, made sense. But now is it going to be, well, if it's a lower middle end dispute, you'll use a system. But if it's a really important one, you'll have an elite mediator or arbitrator do it. So I think that there's a lot of other things coming out of that. That we'll see where they fall. But again, it's astonishing the changes brought on by, geez, we're out of business if we don't adopt technology, and that happened overnight. And we also started addressing issues I don't think we did before, which are security issues. I found it amusing because Mark and I developed some guidelines for the ADR Institute of Canada and Ontario, but doing webinars on Zoom, and people would talk about security, and particularly lawyers who have a right to be concerned about it, and would bring up a question, and my answers would be, so do you use email?
Yeah, I know.
Oh, yeah. So you attach documents to email. Why don't you send a postcard? Really. So I think it's made us think about a lot of those others, the other facets of providing services to our clients. And the other thing that it does is I think it, we design these systems for the real end user, I hope, not the professional end user. So that's going to be a big challenge. And we're seeing that in the tribunal system. In Canada, we have the CRT with its Solution Explorer, which was brilliant. And I know you've done work with BC people as well. And then in Toronto, and Mark can't comment on this, there's the Condominium Authority Tribunal, which is the first fully online tribunal. And, it's, we don't have the stats from the CAT, the Condo Tribunal, but we look at the satisfaction rate at the Civil Resolutions Tribunal. It's astonishing.
Yeah, it really
70% plus, 80% plus of people using the system are happy with it. I doubt you get 7% in court.
Well, the other thing, the CRT, they provide real-time statistics. Every month on the blog, they say, this is how many cases, these are the outcomes. That level of transparency is incredible. You don't get that out of the courts. Maybe you get an annual report out of some, offline court, but I think that level of transparency has played a huge role in the trust that people feel towards the CRT as well. Yeah.
And I think we're seeing the same develop with the Condo Tribunal. There's been a wee bit of pushback because asynchronous communication doesn't fit into the traditional legal billing model. And so I think lawyers are trying to adjust to that. But we have real opportunity here.
That's great.
One of the things that I really like about both of those tribunals is that when they look at their stats of when people access them, they have most activity outside of traditional court hours. So what does that do? It just reinforces for us that the convenience and catering to what works in the schedules of people is not necessarily what traditionally has been the case for generations. One of the neat things about this book is, while we've talked about how far we've come in the past 3 or so years based on the pandemic, the other side here in Canada has been legitimacy that's been afforded through the public justice system. Out in BC, I know there's aspirations to essentially make, by default, small claims court, for example, entirely online, which is just another application of everything that you did with eBay, right? If you start having these situations where, okay, if I'm going to have an issue, because far more people are going to address a dispute in small claims court than are going to go to the Supreme Court, if that's the way you address it is through an online type system, then as part of the public justice system, that becomes your expectation. That becomes your way of life as to how disputes are addressed. And then all of a sudden you have that legitimacy, not only the familiarity of having to connect with family and friends online during a pandemic, but also embedded in our traditional formal public processes. You go online to address these types of disputes. It becomes ingrained in the culture.
It was a number of years ago, Mark and I did a podcast, and we, were kind of brainstorming some ideas. And one of the things we were wondering about was, what's it going to take? And, we kind of decided that if we had online tribunals, that would add legitimacy to using online processes, and that seems to have happened. But the other thing that we forget about, because we're surrounded by it now, is we can make, I think, much stronger cases for the use of ADR because we will have data, which has been a real problem. We haven't had data. I know you're involved with the Queen's AI type data probe, but you can't get
Samuel.
stats on, you can't get stats on AI, and you can't, or sorry, on ADR, and therefore you can't make a really strong case. I mean, even in mindfulness in the business world, there are reports and statistics and all kinds of things, but we don't have that. Most of what we do is anecdotal. We think we have a 70% or 80% settlement rate or whatever. I think this also will help ADR mature in terms of professional status, because we'll be able to actually value what we do in a different way. And that's going to be the big question. How do we show value in the new world of technology and AI? And particularly when you're competing with a tribunal that costs $50, how are you going to justify $300 an hour? So there's going to be a lot of different issues that I don't think we're really thinking about. I don't think that was really articulate. I don't think we're thinking about them, but I think we're going to have to. And so there's lots of challenges, but I think we're not going back, although some courts would like to. It's interesting in Ontario. I think I mentioned it in the book. The Superior Court, its first post-COVID practice direction, wanted and did indeed have default for mandatory mediations as being in person and other processes. Now, this was done without a lot of consultation with the legal community, and our experience, I think, is in Ontario anyway. We're not going back. Lawyers like it, participants like it, and we do too. And so it's a huge change, particularly when you focus on law, which is a profession that's always been backward looking. To try and move it around to something different is quite an achievement, I think, for people like you who've worked in it for a million years now.
Well, yeah, a million years. Yeah, I got the gray hair here. But you quote in the book, you quote Shannon Salter, and she said, our common law tradition is built on the notion that precedent, or what came before, is inherently better and more trustworthy than some uncertain future innovation. And I do want to talk about the courts, because we've spent a lot of time thinking about. We talk about how dispute resolution lives in the shadow of the law. And one of the things that I like, and I know, Colm, you and I have talked about this for years. There's no A in ODR. There's nothing alternative about online dispute resolution. In many of the places where ODR is put in place, it's the only option for redress. That was the case at eBay. The courts were absolutely not an option at all. So we had to build a redress process that was the default. Whereas the courts are used to thinking about dispute resolution. Well, it's an alternative, It's like maybe some cases they can go off and they can find redress in this pathway. But the culture of the courts is suspicious of innovation. The culture of the courts is suspicious of rapid change. There's no incentive within the judiciary to try crazy, wacky new experiments. There actually is a disincentive. I mean, it's designed in such a way to move slowly. And I've had judges say to me, well, the law is not made to be swayed by these fads, like the internet. It's like, well, I'm not sure it's a fad. I think we're a little past the fad stage. But I do think there's a cultural, and I have one foot in the kind of the legal space, and I have another foot in the Silicon Valley space, which is all about new, push, change, disrupt. And then you go into these communities of legal services and government agencies and administrative law, and it's just like, it's like watching paint dry, like change is so difficult to achieve. And that disconnect, to me, it just feels like, because technology is moving so quickly and citizen expectations, litigant expectations are changing, it feels to me like that gulf between society and the way the judiciary works is getting wider every day. And at some point there's going to be a reckoning. But just speak to that cultural, because I think both of you have witnessed that as well, in the work that you do.
Yeah. Marc?
Well, actually, I think it's gotten worse over the past several years, because the courts and the tribunals that have had stuck with in-person processes have only gotten further backlogged. Anytime I see a case that comes across my desk, a decision that's released, I always like to try to figure out just how many years did it take. There are lawyers that I work with here in Canada today. It's, you know, the end of March 2023. They're trying to get a court date. You're looking at the spring or summer 2024. It doesn't make sense, right? When, you know, a lot of the work that we do, if you're dealing with parties that have to have ongoing interactions with one another, it doesn't make sense to take that long. And I think that you're right, that how well the justice system works comes down to the perception of the population of it to deliver justice. And when it takes that long, automatically they're starting off coming from behind, because that doesn't work in this day and age when people are so used to everything else in their lives being delivered significantly faster than justice.
Yeah, I agree with Mark. The gap has widened tremendously, you know, and it's becoming more and more obvious. And when Mark says, you know, get a trial in 2024 in Toronto, he's talking of a pretty simple trial. You're looking for a 5-day or plus trial, you'll be waiting. But that's not true just in Toronto. The mediation I was doing today, the people were in a medium city outside Toronto, and they were saying they were looking at mid-end 2024 for a trial. So the system's breaking down everywhere.
Wow.
Anecdotally, and I won't name names, some senior judges in Ontario and Canada in general, the tradition is, you know, judges are appointed, they're not elected. They can sit till they're 75. Many retire and then come back as part-time judges, supernumerary. In number of jurisdictions in Ontario, senior judges have decided they're not going to come back as supernumerary because they don't want to deal with the technology. So there's a lot of stuff going on just in that alone.
Well, I was having a conversation with some friends in Europe, and we were talking about in France, there was an initiative to track statistics about the performance of judges, you know, like what percentage of the time they decide this way or that way, or how long their cases take, and the judges were so upset about this that they passed a law banning the collection of statistics about the performance of judges, which to me seems so absurd in this era, you know, where it's all data driven, to just pass a law and say, no, we're not going to allow you to take any data. And I think it's the same dynamic that you're naming, Colm, this notion of, I don't like this new era. I'm going to fight back against this era. But I always go when I present to bar associations, you know, and you hear lawyers like say, over my dead body, we're never going to change, you know. It's like, well, you can shake your fist, but the rainstorm is still going to come right over your head, you know. And lawyers are always saying to me, am I going to lose my job due to AI? And I say, well, it's not that lawyers are going to lose. It's not like we're not going to have as many lawyers. It's just that lawyers with AI are going to take the jobs away from lawyers without AI. You know, just like mediators with online are going to take jobs away from mediators without online. So I don't want to scare people into making these changes. I want people to see the upside and sort of embrace it so that they can figure out how to integrate it into their practice. But some of these people that just dig in and say, I'm not going to do it, I think that's going to end in tears.
Well, we're in a transition stage, really. I mean, between putting together, you know, Zoom and Dropbox and everything, and looking at, you know, like Crack or other integrated platforms, which we're seeing. And we're now also beginning to see practice management platforms, ADR Notable, for example, which will integrate into it as well. So we're now seeing pulling everything together at different levels. And I think that makes a huge difference. I think really, it's actually been very, you know, it's felt good to actually said, yeah, we should have done this, you know, years ago, but maybe the technology wasn't there, but it is now. And we've had a lot of positive response, even from people who told us years ago we were, you know, wrong.
Well, what's the Gandhi quote? First they ignore you, then they make fun of you, then they argue with you, and then they say, oh yeah, we always knew you were right. So I feel like we've gone through that cycle, right? A little bit. But and I have a friend who said to me, wow, you know, the pandemic's done more to market ODR than you have in your entire career. You know, like you've been talking about this, but it's been, you know, he said, you're kind of like the dog that caught the car. You know, what are you going to do now? So, yeah, I think it's interesting.
Yeah, back in 2019, I was at this conference at the ADR Institute of Ontario, and my presentation was titled "Arbitrating Online catch up or get left behind. And used a clip from the movie Back to the Future where Marty McFly goes back to the 50s and he's on stage at the high school dance, seeing Johnny Be Good, and nobody really knows what to make of it. You know, preaching to the choir with you, but since the 90s, we knew this was coming.
Right.
The writing's always been on the wall. So I don't think anybody could fairly say that they're surprised that we're moving in this direction. I just think the past few years have accelerated it because of the forced familiarity and acceptance. We always knew was going to happen anyway.
You know, it's funny. I think I said in my first book that Colin reviewed all those years ago, I said, there's a certain tidal inevitability to the expansion of ODR. I feel a little bit like, you know, when Columbus came to the New World and he said, you know, do this and do that to the natives who were there. And they said, well, we're not going to do that. And he said, do that or I'm going to make the sun go away. And they were like, you can't make the sun go away. And then an eclipse happened. But he didn't cause the eclipse, but he knew the eclipse was coming and he took credit for it. So sometimes I feel like with ODR, my career is a little bit like that. Like I had a sense this was going to happen. I didn't know exactly how it was going to play out, but it was inevitable that technology was going to play a greater role in dispute resolution and in the justice system. So now people say, wow, look at you, you called this. Like, well, it seemed to me like it was going to happen. I didn't know the details. As I said, I was skeptical about many of the developments all the way along. But, I also think if you think about how, the disruption of the last 20 years, it's been incredible. I mean, you think about the introduction of social media, the introduction of the iPhone, now the arrival of AI. It's been crazy how much change there's been. But I think the next 20 years is going to be more disruptive. I mean, if you think about the singularity, if you think about quantum computing, if you think about, all the stuff that's coming down the pike, I mean, it's like you start to even it starts to blow your brain up a little bit. Like, what are we? Are we our bodies? Are we our consciousness? Are we gonna, I read a thing the other day. I think Ismail, you were telling me about people are starting to worship AI like gods. You can actually feed all of your information, all your social media and everything, all your writings, all your emails into an AI, and it'll start talking back to you as you. It'll make all the jokes about you. It'll have your turn of phrase. It'll have all your memories. It starts to get a little fuzzy about kind of where we end and where the AI begins. So I don't know.
AI is, the Oracle at Delphi.
And, a little bit, right?
Yeah. I've not completely in joke of saying, maybe I'll do some studies, more formal studies. And I'd like to look at the intersection of technology and religion. And a couple of people went, what? But I'm not so sure that, technology isn't taking place in this almost, for some people, almost quasi-religious, oh my goodness, Well, and of course, I'm old enough that I go, wow, because, first time when I took computer science, it was an IBM 365, bigger than the house I'm in.
Right.
So I'm still in the, ooh, wow, but no, nobody younger is. They're just used to it now. It's the way it is.
My kids are like totally not interested in technology. I was a nerd. When the Apple II came out, I'm like, this is great. I'm going to do this for the rest of my life. They're like, yeah. Okay, whatever. It's a new graphics card. It's just the way it's always been.
That really came across with the jump to Zoom. Mm-hmm. How familiar people were and comfortable with the idea of taking a phone or something else out of a box and turning it on.
Right.
Never thinking about settings. And yet almost everything that was going wrong with Zoom was about settings.
Yeah.
And it was kind of an astonishing thing to look at. Oh yeah, we've just got beyond that.
Yeah, a lot of breakthrough technologies, it's not fundamentally a new mousetrap. It just simplifies it. And the thing about Zoom is it works every time, and it's not that complicated. There's not that many buttons. Yeah.
No.
I think the interesting thing, and again, we're going to do this conference on artificial intelligence, at mediate.com/AI. So I'm endlessly fascinated by this because I'm just reading more and more about it. But I recall there was a friend of mine who spent her entire career studying fruit flies. And she started in college and she did her PhD research and she still studies fruit flies. It's been 40 years. She's been studying fruit flies. And I said to her one time, wow, you must know everything there is to know about fruit flies. She said, I don't know anything about fruit flies. I mean, there's so much more to know about fruit flies. Like I'm just barely scratching the surface. And I think the thing about AI is it's going to understand the world in ways that exceed our ability to comprehend it. I mean, the world is an infinitely complex place. And the only instrument we have to figure out any of that complexity is our brain, which is a pretty good instrument. And for a long time, it was the most sophisticated instrument out there, but soon we're going to get surpassed. I mean, I read a study about some research team in Scandinavia. They fed a bunch of X-rays of human hands into an AI, like 1 million X-rays, and the machine learning algorithm looked at all the X-rays. And then when they gave it a new X-ray of a human hand, it could predict the race of the person whose hand it was to like 98% accuracy. Now, the thing is, no human can look at an X-ray of a human hand and tell you what the race is of that person. But that AI is understanding something deeper that we can't see, that our brain, that our eyes, it's seeing something deeper there, and it can't explain it to us either. It can't say, well, you know, if you want to know what the race is of an X-ray of a human hand, just look for this. So this is what we're going to be dealing with, is the AI is going to understand the fruit flies better than my friend who's been looking at them for 45 years. And it's going to understand the whole world, the whole universe that way. And we're going to have to figure out how to coexist with that. Because the other thing is, the entity that has all that knowledge has no agenda. It doesn't know what to do with it. You know, we're going to be able to ask it questions, and it'll be able to answer those questions. You know,
we hope it has no agenda. But anyway,
that's for another session.
So you know, I guess Mark and I are kind of lucky to put this together just before this explosion. As I said, we wanted to kind of just let people know that it had been around for a while, and now suddenly we're in a different world. So our timing by fluke was pretty good.
Well, it's the tomorrow part. You're gonna have to do another edition of the book, you know, once we're all governed by our new AI masters. But
there you go.
Let me, Ismail, thank you for joining us. I don't know, did you have any questions or any comments you wanted to make before we wrapped it up?
No, absolutely. I wish more time. Sorry, I joined you a little too late, but it's great to be in your presence. Deep minds here. And, you know, digital divide, you touched on the power balance. I wanted to have a conversation of confidentiality, but there's not enough time. But quickly, when we talk about bias and the data itself, you know, ChatGPT and Bard both gather data from all sources, including social media. As we're rushing into utilizing this data integrated into our system, the ODR system, are we doing anything in terms of the integrity of the data itself? So that was the only common question I had. I don't know how much time we have to go into.
No, it's a great question. It ties into what we were talking about before with systemic bias. But Mark and Colin, what do you think about that?
Well, I don't think we're thinking about it enough. I mean, we look at security, but you know, the amounts of data we're now starting to work with, I mean, that would be very, very difficult. But if we're going to the world that Colin's just described, which I think we are, that will become a very important issue. Because if we're going to rely on AI, which is based on, you know, tons and tons of data. I mean, I've heard someone say that, you know, you look at the Twitter takeover and people are saying Elon Musk, oh, why do you do that for? Well, one of the things he got out of that was an amazing amount of data, right? Huge amount of data. Nobody else can probably replicate. Well, we know that a lot of the data on Twitter will be faulty just because of its political nature or other things. So that's a fantastic question. I have no idea how we're going to deal with that. To be fair, I hadn't thought of that in terms of the security side of it. So I guess that's something we need to really look at.
I have some very secure data with me right now that I always like to show when I talk about ODR. Right here.
Oh, look at that.
This. Yeah. And if you have a problem with that, is anybody going to be able to infiltrate this data?
There you go.
So it's all about the technology and the platforms and the way that we use it. We need to make sure that we have the right devices in place to be able to read the data the right way and to be transparent around how we're going to use it.
Mm-hmm.
I thought you were going to pull out one of those big floppy disks, you know, the ones they used on the old
need
word
to work on my arm weight strength to be able to do that.
Mark does that trick in our ODR course, and it's quite surprising how many people don't know what he's got there.
The younger generation, the cassette tape, the 8-track of the future.
Yeah. It's coming back. It's coming back.
There you go. That's right. That's right. Well, I could go on and on. This is such a great conversation. And I just want to tell you, to both of you, thank you so much for writing this book, putting this together, and then being, you know, really I think you're the evangelist for ODR. I don't know what about evangelists. You're the philosophers, the itinerant philosophers of ODR in Canada. And I know a lot of people that are scared about these developments. I think they really are reassured because they know the two of you, they know your hearts, they know that you're committed to dispute resolution, and your understanding of ODR you know, you can help a lot of people through this transition. And I think this book is an enormous contribution in that respect, demystifying it and providing guidance to a lot of people who are nervous about the future path of the field. So thank you for spending the time today. Thank you for the great work on the book. And this is the first of many, many conversations, I'm sure, but I really enjoyed chatting with the both of you.
Same here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.